The scorching summer sun beat down on the bustling crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, eager to witness the time-honored tradition of the changing of the guard. Among the sea of red uniforms stood Sergeant James Washington, one of the few African-American members of the Queen's Guard. His posture was impeccable, his gaze unwavering, a testament to the discipline and dedication that had earned him this esteemed position. As the tourists jostled for the perfect photo opportunity, their cameras trained on the stoic guardsmen, James remained as still as a statue, immune to the excited chatter and the oppressive heat. He had worked tirelessly to reach this moment, overcoming countless obstacles and prejudices along the way. For James, standing guard at the palace was more than just a job. It was a symbol of the progress he had fought for, a reminder that determination could shatter even the most entrenched barriers. Among the throng of spectators stood Eleanor Wigmore, a wealthy American socialite with an air of entitlement that seemed to permeate the very air around her. She scrutinized the guards with a critical eye, her lips curling into a disapproving frown as she took in their traditional uniforms and rigid demeanor. Eleanor had always prided herself on her refined tastes and her ability to spot proper breeding, and in her eyes, the presence of a black man in such a revered position was an affront to the very traditions she held dear. As the ceremony unfolded, Eleanor's muttered comments grew louder, her condescending tone drawing curious glances from those around her. She made no effort to conceal her disdain, openly mocking James' heritage and questioning his right to wear the uniform. The crowd shifted uneasily, some casting apologetic looks in James' direction, others averting their gaze, unwilling to intervene. But James remained steadfast, his eyes fixed straight ahead, his mind focused on the duty that had brought him here. He had faced far worse than the ignorant ramblings of a privileged woman, and he refused to let her words penetrate the armor of his professionalism. Years of rigorous training had taught him to maintain his composure in the face of any challenge, and he drew upon that inner strength now, determined to prove that he belonged exactly where he was. As Eleanor's tirade reached a crescendo, James felt a flicker of anger stirring within him, a righteous indignation at the injustice of her words. But he tamped it down, channeling that energy into an even greater resolve to stand tall and proud, to be a beacon of hope for all those who had ever been told they weren't good enough. He knew that his presence on that palace grounds was a testament to the progress that had been made, and he refused to let one woman's prejudice diminish that achievement. So James stood, an unwavering guardian, a silent sentinel against the forces of hatred and ignorance. He would not be moved, would not be shaken, for he knew that his very existence in the uniform was a powerful statement, a declaration that change was possible, that equality was worth fighting for. And as the sun continued to blaze overhead, James Washington remained a pillar of strength, a living embodiment of the courage and resilience that had brought him to this moment, and that would carry him forward, no matter what challenges lay ahead. Eleanor's frustration mounted as James remained unresponsive to her taunts, his stoic demeanor only fueling her anger. She had always been accustomed to getting her way, to wielding her wealth and status like a weapon, and the guard's refusal to acknowledge her jibes felt like a personal affront. In her mind, she was simply putting him in his place, reminding him of the natural order of things, and his lack of reaction was a direct challenge to the worldview she held so dear. As her verbal attacks grew more vicious, Eleanor's voice rising to a shrill pitch, the crowd around her began to murmur in disbelief. Tourists exchanged shocked glances, their cameras momentarily forgotten as they watched the unfolding drama with a mixture of horror and fascination. Some began to record the incident on their phones, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary, a moment that would soon go viral on social media. Emboldened by her own rage and the attention she was receiving, Eleanor took a step forward, crossing the invisible line that separated the public from the guards. She was now face to face with James, close enough to see the beads of sweat on his brow, the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. But even at this proximity, he remained unmoved, his gaze fixed straight ahead, his jaw clenched with a determined resolve. Eleanor's voice dropped to a menacing whisper as she hissed her final insult, her words dripping with venom. "You're a disgrace to that uniform," she spat, her eyes narrowing with contempt. "You don't belong here. You'll never be one of us." For a moment, James felt his composure waver, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a physical force. He had heard those same sentiments expressed 1,000 times before, in 1,000 different ways, but they never lost their sting. It was a reminder of the battles he still had to fight, the prejudices that lingered just beneath the surface of polite society. But James refused to let her see the impact of her words. He drew in a deep breath, squaring his shoulders and lifting his chin, a silent declaration of his unshakable pride and dignity. He knew that he belonged here, that he had earned his place through blood, sweat, and tears, and no amount of hatred or ignorance could take that away from him. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion, a surreal tableau that would be etched into the memories of all who witnessed it. Eleanor, her face contorted with rage, raised her hand and brought it down across James' cheek, the sound of the slap echoing like a gunshot in the sudden stillness. The crowd gasped in unison, a collective intake of breath that seemed to suck the very air from the surrounding area. For a moment, everything was suspended in a state of shocked disbelief, as if the world itself had ground to a halt. And then, chaos erupted. Tourists began shouting, some in outrage, others in disbelief. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment from every angle, preserving it for posterity. Security personnel surged forward, their radios crackling with urgent messages as they moved to contain the situation. But through it all, James remained motionless, his cheek reddening from the impact of Eleanor's hand, his eyes still fixed straight ahead. It was only when he spoke, his voice booming across the suddenly silent crowd, that the true weight of the moment became clear. "Ma'am," he said, his tone calm but commanding, "I'm going to have to ask you to step back and respect the uniform." Those simple words, spoken with quiet authority, seemed to shatter the spell that had fallen over the assembled onlookers. Eleanor, her face draining of color, stumbled backward, suddenly aware of the magnitude of her actions. The crowd began to murmur once more, their voices rising in a crescendo of disapproval, their cameras trained on the disgraced socialite as she tried to regain her composure. But it was too late. The damage had been done, and Eleanor's reputation lay in tatters at her feet. She had crossed the line, and there would be no going back. As security personnel escorted her away, her head held high in a last-ditch attempt at defiance, James remained at his post, an unmovable force, a symbol of the resilience and strength that had brought him to this moment. And as the crowd began to disperse, their excited chatter filling the air once more, James allowed himself a small, secret smile. He had faced the ultimate test of his character, and he had emerged victorious. No matter what challenges lay ahead, he knew that he had the strength to overcome them, to stand tall in the face of adversity, and to be a beacon of hope for all those who looked to him as an example. As Eleanor staggered away from James, her hands still tingling from the force of the slap, she was immediately surrounded by a swarm of palace security personnel. Their faces were grim, their postures tense, and Eleanor felt a flicker of fear as she realized the gravity of her actions. She had always been accustomed to getting away with her bad behavior, to using her wealth and status as a shield against the consequences of her actions. But this time, she knew she had gone too far. Desperate to salvage the situation, Eleanor fell back on her usual tactics, her voice rising in a shrill, indignant tone as she tried to spin the narrative in her favor. "I tripped," she cried, her eyes wide with feigned innocence. "It was an accident. That guard, he provoked me. But her words were drowned out by the murmurs of the crowd, their voices rising in a chorus of disapproval. Witnesses stepped forward, their accounts of Eleanor's behavior painting a damning picture of entitlement and prejudice. One young woman, her phone held aloft, showed the security personnel a video of the incident, the footage clearly capturing Eleanor's deliberate attack on James. As the evidence mounted, Eleanor's facade of righteous indignation began to crumble. She glanced around wildly, searching for a sympathetic face in the crowd, but found only anger and disgust reflected back at her. In that moment, she realized the true extent of her mistake, the magnitude of the karma she had brought down upon herself. For years, Eleanor had coasted through life on a wave of privilege and entitlement. never once stopping to consider the impact of her actions on those around her. She had looked down on others, confident in her own superiority, secure in the knowledge that her wealth and status would always protect her from the consequences of her behavior. But now, as she was led away from the palace grounds, her designer handbag swinging forlornly at her side, Eleanor began to understand the true cost of her arrogance. She had always believed that respect was something that could be bought, that deference was her birthright, but in a single, shocking moment, she had been forced to confront the ugly truth of her own prejudice. As the crowd watched her go, their murmurs of disapproval ringing in her ears, Eleanor felt a sense of shame and humiliation that she had never experienced before. She had always prided herself on her impeccable reputation, on the air of sophistication and refinement that she cultivated so carefully, but now, she knew that her image had been irreparably tarnished. In the days and weeks that followed, Eleanor's name would become synonymous with entitlement and bigotry, her actions dissected and condemned in the court of public opinion. She would face a barrage of criticism from all quarters, from the media to her own social circle, as the world united in its condemnation of her behavior. But even as she grappled with the fallout of her actions, Eleanor knew that she had no one to blame but herself. She had sown the seeds of her own downfall, and now, she was reaping the bitter harvest of her own ignorance and prejudice. As she was led away from the palace, her head bowed in shame, Eleanor caught a final glimpse of James, still standing tall and proud at his post. In that moment, she realized the true meaning of respect, the value of dignity and honor in the face of adversity. And though it was a painful lesson, one that would stay with her for the rest of her life, Eleanor knew that it was a lesson she had sorely needed to learn. As the chaos of the incident began to subside, James remained at his post, his posture as straight and unyielding as ever. To the casual observer, he might have appeared unaffected by the events that had just transpired, his face a mask of stoic professionalism. But beneath the surface, James was reeling, his mind racing as he tried to process the enormity of what had just occurred. He had faced discrimination before, had encountered prejudice and bigotry at every turn, but never had he experienced something so blatant, so public. In that moment, as Eleanor's hand had connected with his cheek, James had felt a surge of anger and indignation, a burning desire to lash out, to defend himself against the injustice of her actions. But he had held himself in check, had drawn upon the deep well of discipline and self-control that had brought him to this moment. He knew that to react, to allow his emotions to get the better of him, would be to play into the very stereotypes that Eleanor and those like her sought to perpetuate. So James had stood his ground, had remained a pillar of strength and dignity in the face of adversity, and in doing so, he had won a quiet victory, had proven to himself and to the world that he was more than the color of his skin, more than the uniform he wore. As the ceremony drew to a close and the crowds began to disperse, James felt a sense of pride and accomplishment wash over him. He had faced the ultimate test of his character, and he had emerged stronger, more resolute than ever before. But even as he savored the moment, James knew that his work was far from over. Eleanor's actions had been a stark reminder of the prejudice that still lurked beneath the surface of society, the discrimination that he and others like him faced on a daily basis. In the days and weeks that followed, James would become a symbol of resilience and courage, a beacon of hope for all those who had ever been told that they weren't good enough. He would use his platform to speak out against injustice, to advocate for change and equality, to be a voice for the voiceless. And though the road ahead would be long and difficult, James knew that he was ready for the challenge. He had faced the worst that the world had to offer, and he had emerged victorious, a testament to the power of the human spirit, to the indomitable will of those who refused to be broken. As he stood at his post, his eyes fixed on the horizon, James allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. He thought of all the sacrifices he had made, all the obstacles he had overcome to reach this moment, and he knew, with a certainty that came from deep within his soul, that he would continue to fight, to strive, to be a force for good in a world that so often seemed consumed by darkness. For James Washington, the guard's quiet victory was just the beginning, the first step on a journey that would take him to places he had never dreamed possible. and as he stood tall and proud, a living embodiment of the best that humanity had to offer, he knew that he was ready for whatever lay ahead. Eleanor stared at her phone in disbelief, her hand trembling as she watched the video of her confrontation with James go viral before her very eyes. In a matter of hours, the footage had spread like wildfire across social media, shared and reshared by millions of people around the world. And with each passing minute, the condemnation grew louder, the calls for justice more insistent. At first, Eleanor had tried to dismiss the incident, to wave it away as a momentary lapse in judgment, a simple misunderstanding that had been blown out of proportion. But as the public outcry mounted, as her name began to trend on Twitter and her face appeared on every news channel, she realized that there would be no easy escape from the consequences of her actions. Desperate to salvage her reputation, Eleanor released a hastily written apology, a vague and insincere statement that only served to fuel the flames of outrage. Social media exploded with criticism, with commenters picking apart her every word, accusing her of insincerity and callousness in the face of her own wrongdoing. As the backlash intensified, Eleanor began to feel the full weight of her actions, the true cost of her entitlement and prejudice. Her social circle, once a bastion of support and validation, began to distance themselves from her, unwilling to be associated with the scandal that now surrounded her name. Business partners and sponsors, once eager to align themselves with her brand, now rushed to sever ties, fearful of the damage that association with her might bring. Eleanor watched helplessly as her carefully cultivated empire began to crumble around her. The house of cards she had built on a foundation of privilege and entitlement collapsing under the weight of her own hubris. But even as she grappled with the fallout of her actions, Eleanor knew that the true price of her behavior would be far greater than any financial loss or social ostracism. She had been forced to confront the ugly truth of her own prejudice, to see herself through the eyes of those she had so casually denigrated and dismissed. And in that moment of painful self-realization, Eleanor began to understand the true meaning of consequence, the inescapable fact that every action, every word, carried with it the power to shape the world around her, for good or for ill. As the days turned into weeks and the scandal continued to dominate the headlines, Eleanor found herself facing a reckoning that she had never before imagined. She was fined for her behavior, a symbolic gesture that paled in comparison to the true cost of her actions. But even as she wrote the check, her hands shaking with a mixture of anger and shame, Eleanor knew that the real price would be paid in the court of public opinion, in the judgment of a world that had finally seen her for who she truly was. The incident at Buckingham Palace became a watershed moment in the ongoing conversation about privilege, racism, and accountability. News outlets across the globe picked up the story, dissecting every aspect of the confrontation between Eleanor and James. Social commentators and activists used the incident as a launching point for broader discussions about systemic inequality and the persistence of prejudice in modern society. James, meanwhile, found himself thrust into an unexpected spotlight. Military officials, impressed by his composure during the incident, recommended him for a promotion. Letters and messages of support flooded in from around the world, many from young people of color who saw in him a role model of dignity and strength under pressure. Despite the attention, James maintained his characteristic humility. When asked about the incident in a rare interview, he simply stated, "I stood my ground because that's what the uniform demands. It's not about me, it's about what we represent." His words resonated deeply with people across all walks of life, transcending racial and social boundaries. Eleanor's life took a dramatically different turn. Her social media accounts remained dormant, her once bustling calendar of society events empty. The luxury brands that had once courted her endorsements quietly removed her from their campaigns. Her name became synonymous with entitled behavior, featured in academic papers and social psychology courses as a case study in unconscious bias and its consequences. 6 months after the incident, Eleanor made her first public appearance at a diversity and inclusion conference, not as a speaker but as an attendee. She sat in the back row, taking notes, her designer clothes replaced by understated business attire. Those who saw her noted a marked change in her demeanor, the haughty confidence replaced by something that looked like genuine introspection. The palace itself implemented new training protocols for handling discriminatory incidents, using footage from that day, with James's permission, as a teaching tool for new guards. The incident had exposed an uncomfortable truth that even in the most prestigious institutions, prejudice could rear its ugly head. 1 year to the day after the confrontation, James stood at his post, the summer sun once again beating down on the palace grounds. Tourists still gathered, cameras still clicked, but there was something different in the air. When people approached the guards now, there was a new level of respect, a deeper understanding of the dignity of the position. A young black girl in the crowd caught James's eye, her face beaming with pride as she watched him stand at attention. Her mother whispered something in her ear, and James could read the girl's lips as she replied, "I want to be just like him when I grow up." In that moment, James felt the weight of his responsibility more keenly than ever before. The incident had changed more than just 2 lives. It had sparked a conversation that continued to reverberate through society. Eleanor's actions had demonstrated how quickly privilege could crumble when confronted with its own ugliness, while James's response had shown how dignity and professionalism could triumph over prejudice. As the sun began to set on another day at Buckingham Palace, James reflected on how a single moment could alter the course of so many lives. He had never sought to be a symbol or a catalyst for change, but fate had thrust that role upon him, and in accepting it with grace and courage, he had helped to write a new chapter in the ongoing story of human progress. The legacy of that summer day continued to unfold, touching lives in ways that neither James nor Eleanor could have predicted. It served as a reminder that in the face of prejudice, it was not the initial act of discrimination that defined the moment, but rather the response to it, both from the individual targeted and from society as a whole. The legacy of that summer day rippled outward, touching lives far beyond the iron gates of Buckingham Palace. In universities across the globe, professors began incorporating the incident into their curriculum, using it as a case study in social justice, privilege, and institutional change. Students engaged in heated debates about the intersection of tradition and progress, about the role of historical institutions in modern society, and about the power of individual actions to spark systemic change. James's story became the subject of a documentary film. Though he initially hesitated to participate, the filmmakers convinced him by arguing that his experience could serve as inspiration for others facing similar challenges. The resulting film, Standing Guard, premiered at several international festivals, winning acclaim for its nuanced exploration of race, duty, and personal dignity. Eleanor, in an unexpected turn of events, began working with anti-racism organizations, though she kept a low profile. She funded scholarships for minority students pursuing careers in public service, specifically requesting that her name not be attached to the programs. Some viewed her actions with skepticism, seeing them as attempts at reputation rehabilitation, while others recognized genuine transformation in her efforts to make amends. The Queen's Guard itself underwent subtle but significant changes. While maintaining its storied traditions, the organization began actively recruiting from more diverse backgrounds, recognizing that excellence knew no racial or social boundaries. James was asked to participate in recruitment initiatives, though he insisted on doing so quietly, without publicity. 5 years after the incident, James found himself promoted to a training position where he could directly influence the next generation of guards. This teaching style emphasized not just the physical discipline required for the role, but also the mental fortitude needed to maintain composure in the face of adversity. His trainees learned that true strength often meant standing still when every instinct screamed to react. The tourist who had captured the original viral video released a follow-up piece on the 10th anniversary of the incident. The new video included interviews with witnesses who had been present that day, each describing how the event had altered their own perspectives on privilege and prejudice. One American tourist spoke of returning home and becoming involved in civil rights activism, inspired by James's quiet dignity. Social media platforms periodically resurfaced the footage, sparking fresh conversations about how far society has come and how far it still needs to go. Each new generation discovers the incident, finding in it relevant lessons for their own struggles with discrimination and inequality. Memes and social commentary emerge, transforming the moment into a cultural touchstone that refuses to fade into historical obscurity. The palace grounds themselves became a different kind of symbol, While tourists still flocked to witness the changing of the guard, many now came with a deeper appreciation for the men and women behind the uniforms. Tour guides incorporated the story into their narratives, using it to illustrate how even centuries-old institutions could adapt and evolve. James's daughter, born 3 years after the incident, grew up understanding that her father's contribution to history went beyond his military service. At school, when studying civil rights and social progress, she could point to a living example of how dignity and restraint could be powerful weapons against prejudice. She watched with pride as her father's story inspired others to stand tall in their own moments of trial. Eleanor's own children, now adults themselves, spoke publicly about how their mother's actions and subsequent journey had forced them to confront their own inherited biases. They established a foundation dedicated to promoting understanding across social and racial divides, turning their family's shame into a force for positive change. Academic researchers began studying what they termed the Buckingham effect, the phenomenon where a single, well-documented incident of discrimination leads to lasting institutional change. They found that organizations that used the incident as a teaching tool showed measurable improvements in workplace diversity and inclusion metrics. The legal system, too, felt the impact of that summer day. Courts began citing the incident in cases involving public discrimination, using it as a benchmark for understanding how seemingly personal actions could have broader societal implications. Legislative bodies referenced it when drafting new anti-discrimination laws, particularly those involving public servants. International military organizations incorporated the incident into their training protocols, using it to demonstrate the importance of maintaining professionalism in the face of provocation. James was invited to speak at military academies around the world, though he accepted only a select few engagements, preferring to let his actions speak louder than his words. The media landscape evolved in its coverage of similar incidents, with journalists developing more nuanced approaches to reporting on discrimination. The Buckingham Standard became shorthand for responsible coverage that balanced public interest with respect for dignity and professionalism. As society continued to grapple with issues of race and privilege, the incident remained a powerful reminder that progress often came not through grand gestures or sweeping reforms, but through individual moments of courage and restraint. It showed that sometimes the most powerful response to hatred was simply to stand one's ground, maintaining dignity in the face of indignity.